The air in McAllen, Texas, in the spring of 1960, was thick with the sweet scent of citrus blossoms and the particular humidity of the Rio Grande Valley. It was a time of defined lines, of clear rights and wrongs, a community stitched together by family and faith. In this community, Irene Garza was a shining thread. At 25 years old, she was more than just a local beauty queen, a former Miss All South Texas sweetheart. She was a reflection of the town's highest aspirations. Her intelligence was as sharp as her dark, kind eyes, and her piety was as genuine as the smile that seemed to permanently grace her lips. She was a second-grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary, a calling she pursued with a quiet, fierce dedication. For Irene, teaching wasn't just a job, it was a mission. She saw the future of her community in the faces of the children she taught, many from backgrounds of hardship, and she poured her heart into giving them a foundation of knowledge and confidence. She was the pride of her parents, Nicholas and Josefina Garza, who had built a successful dry cleaning business from the ground up, moving their family from the south side of town to a more prosperous neighborhood, a testament to their belief in the American dream. Irene lived that dream with a humble grace. She was deeply devout, a member of the Legion of Mary, finding strength and solace in daily Mass. Her life revolved around a trinity of purpose: her family, her faith, and her students. Her days were a rhythm of familiar comforts: the morning bell at school, the respectful greetings from her students' parents, the quiet evenings at home with her own. Holy Week in 1960 felt like any other. The town was draped in a sense of solemn anticipation, preparing for the crescendo of Easter Sunday. For Irene, it was a time of deep spiritual reflection. On the evening of Holy Saturday, April 16th, the sky outside the Garza home deepened to a bruised purple. Irene, dressed immaculately as always, informed her parents she was going to Sacred Heart Church for confession. It was a routine act, a sacrament of purification before the joyous celebration of the resurrection. There was no premonition, no shadow of fear in her farewell. It was just another Saturday evening, another visit to a place that was as much a home to her as the house she had just left. As she drove away in the fading light, the air was still and warm, carrying the last of the day's heat. No one in the Garza family, no one in the entire town of McAllen, could possibly imagine that this ordinary sacred act was the beginning of a silence that would stretch for 57 years. The interior of Sacred Heart Church was a cavern of hushed reverence. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of old wood, melting beeswax, and the faint, sweet perfume of lilac being prepared for the Easter services. Soft light filtered through stained glass, painting muted jewels of color on the stone floor. Parishioners moved with a quiet purpose, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast space. On this Holy Saturday, Irene Garza joined the line of those waiting for confession. She was a familiar, respected figure here. Among the priests serving the parish was a visiting clergyman, Father John Feit. He was 27, a relatively new face, and some found his demeanor intense. That night, witnesses would later recall, the line for Father Feit's confessional moved at a crawl. There were moments when he seemed to be absent from the sanctuary altogether, small, unexplained breaks in the sacred rhythm of the evening. Irene, patient and devout, waited her turn. When she finally entered the private space of the confessional, she knelt, ready to unburden her soul in preparation for Easter. This was the last time anyone from the congregation would see her alive. The sacrament of confession is a seal of absolute secrecy, a sacred trust between a penitent and their God, with the priest as a mere vessel. But on this night, that sacred space became a doorway to a nightmare. The secrets whispered in the dark were not of sin and absolution, but of a darkness that would soon swallow Irene Garza whole, leaving behind only a terrifying, echoing silence. As the hours crept past midnight, the Garza home, once a place of serene evening quiet, became a theater of rising anxiety. Nicholas and Josefina Garza sat in their living room, the silence between them growing heavier with each tick of the clock. At first, they reasoned, Perhaps she had stayed for the long Easter Vigil Mass. It was plausible. Irene was devout. But as 1 o'clock became 2, and 2 o'clock bled into 3, reason gave way to a cold, creeping dread. The familiar nocturnal sounds of the neighborhood, a distant dog bark, the hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify the emptiness, the wrongness of the hour. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her bed was still perfectly made. This was not Irene. She was meticulous, thoughtful, always calling if her plans changed. By 3 in the morning, the pretense of calm shattered completely. The fear was no longer a whisper, but a scream in their minds. They drove through the deserted streets to the McAllen Police Department, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. The officer on duty listened with a practiced patience that felt agonizingly slow to Irene's frantic parents. A missing person, a grown woman. The initial response was tempered, procedural. But for Nicholas and Josefina, this was not a procedure. This was the tearing of their world. A daughter, the center of their universe, had vanished on the holiest of nights from the safest of places. The search for Irene Garza began as a ripple of concern and quickly swelled into a tidal wave of community action, the largest volunteer effort the Rio Grande Valley had ever seen. The days that followed her disappearance were a blur of frantic activity and agonizing hope. Her face, captured in a black and white photograph, looked out from newspapers and storefront windows. Her smile, a haunting reminder of the vibrant life that had been so suddenly extinguished. Volunteers, hundreds of them, fanned out across the dusty roads and dense brushland of Hidalgo County. They walked shoulder to shoulder through citrus groves and along the banks of irrigation canals, their calls of Irene swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The Texas sun beat down, relentless and oppressive. Each passing hour without news felt like a physical blow to her family. Then, on Monday, April 18th, a discovery. Along a rural road, searchers found a scattering of Irene's belongings. Her purse, a single elegant shoe, the delicate lace veil she wore to church. The items lay there in the dirt, a heartbreaking trail of breadcrumbs leading to a terrifying, unknown destination. The discovery electrified the search, but it also painted a grim picture. This wasn't a case of a young woman running away. This was an abduction. This was violence. The community held its breath, praying for a miracle, even as the evidence pointed toward a tragedy. The murky, slow-moving water of an irrigation canal on the outskirts of McAllen held the final devastating answer. On Thursday, April 21st, 5 days after she went to confession, a searcher spotted something in the water. It was the body of Irene Garza. The hope that had sustained her family and the community for 5 agonizing days collapsed into unspeakable grief. The scene was cordoned off, the quiet hum of the rural landscape replaced by the grim efficiency of law enforcement. Irene's body was gently lifted from the water, the vibrant young woman now a tragic, silent figure. The autopsy would later reveal the brutal details of her final hours. She had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. The cause of death was asphyxiation. She had been suffocated. The water had washed away much of the physical evidence, a final, cruel act of erasure. But the truth of the violence inflicted upon her was undeniable. The news tore through McAllen like a shockwave, leaving disbelief and horror in its wake. How could this happen here? How could a woman so good, so pious, meet such a depraved end? The sanctity of Holy Week had been desecrated, and the heart of the community was broken. The investigation into who had committed this monstrous act began immediately, and from the very start, suspicion began to coalesce around the one place Irene was last seen, a place that should have been a sanctuary, the church. In the sterile, quiet rooms of the McAllen Police Department, the investigation began to focus. Detectives methodically pieced together Irene's last known movements, and every path led back to Sacred Heart Church and the visiting priest who heard her final confession, Father John Feit. Feit, just 27 years old, presented a calm, almost detached demeanor under questioning. He admitted he heard Irene's confession, but his story was riddled with small, troubling inconsistencies. He claimed he heard her confession, not in the traditional, screened confessional booth, but in the rectory, the priest's residence. This was highly unusual. Then, there was the matter of his hands. An assistant pastor, Father Joseph O'Brien, noticed fresh scratches on the backs of Feit's hands in the hours after Irene vanished. Feit's explanations for these injuries were vague and unconvincing. The detectives felt a growing certainty, a gut instinct that the man in the black clerical clothing was hiding a terrible secret. Their suspicions intensified dramatically with a bizarre discovery. Weeks after Irene's body was found, police drained the canal where she was discovered. Lying in the muddy bottom was a peculiar object, a portable green plastic photo slide viewer. It was an item one might take on a trip, not something you'd expect to find in a canal. When police publicized the find, they received a startling response. A note, penned by John Feit himself, admitting the slide viewer was his. He claimed he must have lost it. It was a critical piece of physical evidence linking him directly to the scene where Irene's body was left. A silent witness dredged from the murky depths. As investigators dug deeper into Father John Feit's past, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The violence inflicted upon Irene Garza was not an isolated burst of rage. Just weeks before Irene's murder, in the nearby town of Edinburgh, another young woman named Maria America Guerra had been attacked in a church. As she knelt in prayer, a man grabbed her from behind, attempting to force a rag over her mouth. She fought back and screamed, and her attacker fled. When Maria was later asked to look at a lineup, she identified her attacker, Father John Feit. He was charged with assault, but in a move that would later be heavily scrutinized, he was allowed to plead no contest to a lesser charge and paid a mere $500 fine. The incident was effectively swept under the rug. This prior attack, so chillingly similar in its setting, a sacred space, turned into a hunting ground, cast a dark shadow of premeditation over Irene's murder. It suggested a predator who used the trust afforded by his caller to get close to his victims. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the slide viewer, the scratches, the inconsistent alibi, and the prior assault, the investigation stalled. There was an unspoken but palpable pressure emanating from the Catholic Church. In 1960, the Church held immense power and influence, particularly in a devout community like McAllen. The idea of a priest being a rapist and a murderer was not just shocking. It was unthinkable, a scandal to be contained at all costs. Key witnesses felt intimidated. The official channels of justice seemed to slow, then stop. Feit was quietly transferred out of Texas, sent first to a monastery in Missouri, and then to a treatment center for troubled priests in New Mexico. The case of Irene Garza, once a blazing inferno of public outrage, was reduced to embers, then to ash. It went cold. For the Garza family, the decades that followed were a long, agonizing winter of unanswered questions. While the world moved on, their lives remained frozen in April of 1960. They kept Irene's room as she had left it, a shrine to a life stolen too soon. They marked her birthday every year, celebrating a ghost. They relentlessly pressured law enforcement, writing letters, making phone calls, refusing to let their daughter's memory be buried by time and indifference. They were a constant, quiet, dignified presence, a living embodiment of the injustice that had been allowed to stand. For them, justice was not about vengeance. It was about truth. It was about honoring the memory of their daughter and ensuring the man they believed was responsible for her death was held accountable. Their persistence was a quiet, steady drumbeat against a wall of institutional silence. Meanwhile, John Feit lived a completely different life. He left the priesthood in the early 1970s, married, had a family, and settled into a comfortable suburban existence in Arizona, working for a Catholic charity. He was a grandfather, a respected member of his community. The dark secret of that Holy Saturday in McAllen was buried deep, a ghost he had seemingly outrun. But the persistence of the Garza family and the conscience of a few good men would ensure that the past could not stay buried forever. The first crack in the wall of silence came in 2002, more than 40 years after Irene's murder. A Texas Ranger named Rudy Jaramillo, a member of a newly formed cold case unit, took a fresh look at the dormant file. Jaramillo was a tenacious, old-school lawman, and the story of the murdered schoolteacher and the powerful priest who got away resonated with his innate sense of justice. He began the painstaking process of re-interviewing every living person connected to the case. His investigation led him to a man named Dale Tacheny. In the early 1960s, Tacheny had been a monk at the Missouri monastery where John Feit was sent after leaving Texas. As a counselor to other clergy, Tacheny had heard Feit's confession, not a sacramental confession, but a therapeutic unburdening. And in that session, Feit had admitted everything. He told Tacheny how he had attacked a young woman after hearing her confession on Easter weekend, how he had bound and gagged her, and how he had dumped her body in a canal. Tacheny, bound by a sense of clerical confidentiality at the time, had kept the secret. But decades later, having left the priesthood himself, he knew he could no longer remain silent. He told Ranger Jaramillo everything. His testimony was a bombshell, a direct confession from the killer's own mouth, preserved for 4 decades. The ghost of Irene Garza had begun to speak. Armed with Dale Tacheny's explosive testimony, Ranger Jaramillo also tracked down Father Joseph O'Brien, the other priest from Sacred Heart, who had seen the scratches on Feit's hands. O'Brien, now elderly and in failing health, finally broke his own long silence. He admitted to Jaramillo that Feit had not only shown him the scratches, but had also confessed to him shortly after the murder. The church, O'Brien confirmed, had orchestrated a cover-up to avoid scandal, pressuring him and others to stay quiet and spiriting Feit away to protect the institution's reputation. It was a stunning admission of a conspiracy of silence that had obstructed justice for over 40 years. With 2 confessions now on the record, the case against Feit seemed overwhelming. In 2004, the evidence was presented to a grand jury in Hidalgo County. The Garza family and the community held their breath, believing that justice was finally at hand. But in a move that caused widespread disbelief and outrage, the grand jury failed to return an indictment. The then district attorney, Irene Garza, argued that the evidence was too old, that the witnesses were unreliable. The case, which had come so close to resurrection, was once again shoved back into its cold, dark grave. The decision was a crushing blow to the Garza family and to the investigators who had worked so hard to bring the truth to light. It seemed that even after 4 decades, the shadows of the past were still powerful enough to shield John Feit. For another decade, the case languished. The Garza family, though heartbroken, refused to give up. They became fixtures at political rallies and community events, their presence a silent rebuke to the stalled justice system. They advocated for a new district attorney, someone who would have the courage to take on the powerful interests that had protected Feit for so long. Their prayers were finally answered in 2014 with the election of Ricardo Rodriguez Jr. as the new Hidalgo County District Attorney. Rodriguez had made the Irene Garza case a central promise of his campaign, vowing to the family and the community that he would re-examine the evidence and seek an indictment if the facts supported it. True to his word, Rodriguez reopened the investigation. His team meticulously rebuilt the case, armed with the powerful testimonies of Tacheny and the late Father O'Brien, and a renewed determination to see justice done. In February 2016, a new grand jury was convened. This time, there would be no failure of nerve. The grand jury handed down a true bill, indicting 83-year-old John Feit for the murder of Irene Garza. The news was met with tears of joy and relief by Irene's surviving family members. After 56 years of waiting, the legal battle for Irene had finally begun. In Scottsdale, Arizona, the past finally caught up with John Feit. Now a frail, elderly man who used a walker to get around, he was arrested for a crime he committed as a young man in a different lifetime. Extradited back to Texas, he stood in a Hidalgo County courtroom, a ghost from a half-forgotten scandal, to answer for the murder of Irene Garza. His trial began in November of 2017. The courtroom was a time capsule, a bridge between two vastly different eras. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rodriguez, methodically laid out the case that had been suppressed for so long. They presented the evidence of the slide viewer, the testimony about the scratches on Feit's hands, and the chilling account of his previous attack on Maria America Guerra. The star witness was Dale Tesheny, the former monk. Now an old man himself, he took the stand and in a clear, unwavering voice recounted the detailed confession John Feit had made to him in the monastery all those years ago. He described how Feit had told him he assaulted Irene in the church rectory, took her to a different location, and suffocated her with a plastic bag over her head. For the first time in a public forum, the horrifying details of Irene's last moments were laid bare. The courtroom listened, rapt and horrified. The defense argued that the evidence was too old, the witnesses' memories were faded, and that the church and law enforcement were looking for a scapegoat after decades of failure. They pointed to the lack of any DNA or forensic evidence directly tying Feit to the crime. But the prosecution's narrative was powerful. A story of a predator hiding behind a priest's collar and a conspiracy of silence that allowed him to escape justice for nearly a lifetime. On December 7, 2017, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with 57 years of anticipation. Irene Garza's surviving relatives clutched each other's hands, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear. John Feit, now 85 years old, sat impassively at the defense table. The foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge unfolded the paper and read the single powerful word, guilty. A wave of emotion washed over the courtroom. Sobs of relief and tears of joy flowed freely from the Garza family. After 57 years, 7 months, and 21 days, they finally had it. Justice. The next day, John Feit was sentenced to life in prison. The judge, in handing down the sentence, acknowledged the immense suffering of the Garza family and the long, dark road they had traveled to reach this day. Feit, showing no emotion, was led from the courtroom to spend his final years behind bars. The man who had taken a life filled with so much promise and who had hidden from the consequences for more than half a century would finally be held accountable. The silence that began on that Holy Saturday in 1960 was finally definitively broken. John Feit died in prison in 2020, closing the final chapter on a case that had haunted a community for generations. The story of Irene Garza is a tragic one, a story of a beautiful life extinguished by a predator who hid in a place of sanctuary. But it is also a story of enduring love, of a family's unbreakable resolve, and of the powerful, simple truth that justice, no matter how long it is delayed, can never be truly denied.